Hey, it's Nikachu. Now, since Modern Horizons 1, Force of Negation had a significant impact against all combo decks, even mid-range decks, because people hated when the control deck would tap out for Jace the Mind Sculptor and the coast still wasn't clear. Blue finally had a free answer to the opponent's threats, until today, because now there is a free answer to the free answers. Introducing Modern Horizon 2's Grief. Adequately named because when people cast this spell, that's only what the opponent is going to feel. But before we dive deep into this card, love to give a shout out to our sponsor, FusionGamingOnline.com. Don't be afraid of buying combo cards because now Grief is going to clear the way. Fusion Gaming Online is your place to get all Modern Horizons 2 singles and sealed product. Don't forget to use coupon code Nikachu at checkout. Supports the channel and gets you 5% off all your purchases. So how is Grief the answer to all the answers? Well, let's look at this card. It's a double black 2 generic elemental incarnation. It's got menace. It's a 3/2 creature. But when Grief enters the battlefield, target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it. That player discards that card. This card has a lot of similar parallels to something like Thought-Knot Seer, to be honest. This was a 4-mana card, reasonable body, that also ripped a card from the opponent's hand. Evoke. Exile a black card from your hand, which means you can pay the alternate evoke cost. This thing's going to enter the battlefield and will have to be immediately sacrificed. So therefore, you can exile a black card from your hand. Grief enters the battlefield through the evoke cost, is going to have to go to the graveyard, but you still get the ETB trigger. You can look at your opponent's hand, take a card from it. This is fantastic for the combo decks. This parallels almost something perfectly in Legacy. Unmask, a classic card. Remove a black card in your hand from the game instead of paying Unmask's casting cost. Look at target player's hand and choose a non-land card from it. That player discards that card. But here's the deal, just how they made Force of Negation the fixed version of Force of Will, because this version of Force of Will, it can only be used for good. It's only on defense. You can't use it like Force of Will, where you're trying to play a combo deck and you're trying to protect your proactive plan. No, you can't do that with Force of Negation, or at least it's very hard. You'd have to be comboing off on your opponent's turn. Same thing with Grief, and I'll explain why. Unmask, originally, you could target any player, including yourself. So if you're a Reanimator deck, you need your card in the graveyard immediately. Well, you could just unmask yourself, put that card in the graveyard, and immediately go reanimate it. But with Grief, you can only target your opponent, so it can only be used for good, I guess, except the problem is it's only going to be put in like combo-ish decks or decks that are going to abuse this effect, so it's really being used for bad. But you get the idea. And I think for all the decks that were complaining about Force of Negation, like, how do we beat this card? How do I interact with my opponent's hand? Well, now you've got some sort of answer. I mean, Grief is going to be perfect in perhaps a Living End deck because it doesn't get hit by the Cascade spells. It's a 4-mana creature. It would be fantastic in some sort of Grishal brand, maybe a Goryo's Vengeance deck. So you can Grief the opponent, make sure the coast is clear, take away any of the interaction. By the way, it can be several pieces of interaction. It doesn't have to be Force Negation. It can be sideboard hate cards. It could be anything that's going to interact with the graveyard at instant speed. Grief is going to be there. But here's the deal. I mean, this card is superior, in my opinion, to Unmask because of the late game potential. When you draw Unmask in the late game, it's just a dead card. It's just a stupid discard spell. But here, you got a body. There's matches against combo decks. They play out in such a way that both sides barely have any resource, and maybe the player that's stabilized has like a random 2/2 creature in play. Well, now you can put a 3/2 creature in play, either stabilize the board, or maybe you go start attacking your opponent. Maybe you just had to finish them off. Grief gives some game to the combo decks, where if they fizzle and you're just top decking, you got something to do. You don't have to essentially wait to reassemble your entire combo. So I'm just curious, all the naysayers for Force of Negation, oh, free spells are bad for Magic, I would love to hear what they have to say about Grief in this case, because I have a feeling they're going to approve of Grief.
Force of Negation, all broken.
But now that they got something they can put in their deck,
Oh, this is perfectly fine.
all of a sudden, free spells are pretty good in their book. Now, what I'm gathering from the community is that they are terrified of this card. The price of adult diapers, they're skyrocketing, there's a shortage, people are spontaneously shitting themselves over a very specific interaction, and that is with Ephemerate. Ephemerate says exile target creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control, and it has rebound. Now, that's very specifically interesting when you talk about Grief, because Grief doesn't cost any mana. You can put a land in play, some sort of godless shrine or plains. You play Grief for free, then with the evoke trigger on the stack, that's where you sneak in that Ephemerate and blink the creature. Now that's going to be important because that trigger's still on the stack. You still get to take a card. But if you blink the creature, you blink the Grief, it's going to come into play, and without the evoke liability. So you're going to keep the 3/2 creature, you get a second trigger off the Grief, which means you get to rip 2 cards out of your opponent's hand, and guess what? Next turn, it's coming back, and you get to take a 3rd card by turn 2. It's going to be impossible for your opponent to empty their hand. You're going to strip them of 3 cards, and all it did was cost you 2, and you have a 3/2 creature on the battlefield. Now, I personally am not super sold by this interaction. It's going to be annoying. Everyone hates Thoughtseize. This is potentially Thoughtseize times 3. But the deal is they're losing cards themselves. I mean, they lost the black card that they used to play this for free. They're going to lose the Ephemerate, and you're not exactly going to be attacking immediately with this Grief, because even by turn 2, after you blink the Grief, I mean, you still can't attack. It's going to have summoning sickness. So you still have some time to build up your board, stabilize, get on that battlefield, because it's not the hand that matters in Magic. It's what's on the board. And if you can just play your land drops and start top decking things, I mean, the Grief player still has to prove that they can still win the game. Not to mention, you know, stripping cards from your opponent's hand doesn't always work out for you in every single matchup. Remember, the graveyard is still a resource, so it can backfire. So this only works really well when you're on the play, but even then, you start the game off with less cards than your opponent, and your opponent's on the draw, so they're up 1 more card than usual. The strategy sort of reminds me of what 8-Rack is trying to do, and that is just to make you discard a bunch of your hand. But in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't have that significant amount of an impact despite what they strip away from you. So I personally don't really feel like this discard strategy is going to overpower the format. If anything, it is going to be good against some resource-based decks, but I don't think it's going to have enough of an impact against decks that are just playing singularly powerful cards, like especially the Titan decks or the Tron decks. Okay, they'll just be like, make land drop, land drop, land drop, and their top decks are really strong, and then all of a sudden, boom! Now who's experiencing Grief? There is one more deck that this could slot in relatively comfortably. Maybe this is a piece that Eldrazi Taxes could like to play. It was a deck that played with Tidehollow Sculler that also rips cards from your opponent's hand, Wasteland Strangler, cards that were exiled by other creatures like Tidehollow Sculler or Thought-Knot Seer. You can have those go to the graveyard, and then all of a sudden you can pick off creatures, and those things were blinked by Eldrazi Displacer. And I think all of these cards, Tidehollow Sculler, Wasteland Strangler, Thought-Knot Seer, are all potential Ephemerate targets. Not to mention, Eldrazi Displacer probably works relatively well with Grief. And while Grief may not directly slot into the Eldrazi Taxes deck, certainly a deck built around Grief can borrow a lot from those archetypes. And if anyone else knows where this card belongs, let me know in the comments section below. This is without a question a Modern staple, and while I can't promise that it's going to be one of the most powerful cards in Modern, I can promise it's going to be one of the most feel-bad cards in the format. Like, the upside is going to be there if your opponent can pull it off, But remember, generally speaking, this is mostly going to be a 2-for-1 for the opponent. Well, that's my video for today. Let me know, what kind of deck do you play, and do you fear this card? Are you the one buying the diapers? Or are you selling them? Smash like for Evoke Elementals, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more spoiler cards, or you'll mulligan to 5 against every Grief deck.